Imani Rhodes walked into Kingsley Crown to test drive the sedan she had booked an appointment for. Her plain jacket, her dark skin, and the worn bag she carried made General Manager Preston Hale look at her the way a man looks at something he has already decided to discard. In front of a full showroom, he reached across and took the key from his own employee's hand and announced that his vehicles were not for people who came only to take photographs. Imani did not argue. She made one call, opened a financial file, and asked him calmly, "How many cars were inside this building?" Stay with this story to the end, because what Imani did next was not just about buying cars. It was about something money alone cannot purchase. The city of Atlanta carried a particular kind of heat in late September, not just the kind that pressed from above, but the kind that radiated off the glass and steel of buildings constructed to impress. And the Kingsley Crown flagship, Georgia location, sat at the edge of a boulevard, where the streetlights were ornamental, and the parking attendants wore uniforms pressed hard enough to hold a crease in the afternoon sun. The showroom held 15 vehicles arranged across polished concrete floors, each one lit from above by recessed fixtures designed to make chrome look like something almost sacred. And the staff who moved between them had been trained over years to read money before a single word was exchanged. On that particular Friday, just past 3 o'clock, a woman parked a sedan that had accumulated more than 130,000 miles near the building's side entrance, stepped out carrying a soft leather bag that had seen better decades, and walked through the main doors wearing a jacket she had purchased 3 years before, during a sale she had not needed to wait for, but had waited for anyway, out of a habit that had never entirely left her. Her name was Imani Rhodes, and she had a confirmed test drive appointment for 2:45 under the initials I. Rhodes, which the system had flagged as a corporate priority booking, but which no one at the front desk had apparently considered worth checking. The lobby greeter offered a smile that arrived slightly behind schedule and returned to his monitor, without asking whether she needed assistance, and a senior sales consultant named Gavin Pike stood near a cluster of customers who had arrived 12 minutes after Imani and were being walked through a cream-colored coupe with the kind of attentiveness usually reserved for people who have already handed over a deposit. Imani did not approach either of them. She stood near the entrance, holding her bag, watching the floor with the expression of someone conducting an evaluation that the room did not yet know it was being subjected to, and for 3 minutes she stood without being acknowledged, studying the way the staff sorted people without ever appearing to sort them, noting which arrivals produced immediate eye contact, and which produced a particular quality of looking through that is so practiced it becomes almost invisible to everyone, except the person it is aimed at. It was Tessa Monroe who finally crossed the floor with a genuine smile, and no calculation behind it. A young woman 7 months into her career at the dealership, who offered water and asked about the appointment with a directness that distinguished her immediately from the performance happening elsewhere in the room. She pulled up the booking system and found the reservation in under 30 seconds, and what she found alongside it made her expression shift not with embarrassment, but with the specific urgency of someone who has just realized the stakes of a situation are different from what she assumed. The entry read Preferred Fleet Client. Handle with priority. She excused herself to retrieve the test drive key for the Crown Aurelius LX, and she was holding it, walking back toward Imani, when Preston Hale appeared from behind a glass partition and crossed the showroom floor with the deliberate stride of a man certain the authority he is about to exercise belongs to him entirely. He took the key from Tessa's hand, turned to face Imani with an expression so composed it barely registered as hostility at all, and asked her, in a voice pitched just loud enough to carry, whether she was certain she had come to the right dealership. Tessa stood 2 steps behind him with her hands at her sides, watching the moment unfold the way a person watches, something they are not sure they have the standing to interrupt, and several of the other customers who had been moving through the showroom slowed in the way people slow when a social collision is about to happen, and curiosity has outpaced the polite instinct to look away. Imani Rhodes had spent enough years in rooms where people underestimated her to recognize the specific architecture of what was being constructed. A series of questions shaped not to gather information but to manufacture an exit, designed to make the person on the receiving end feel that leaving was their own idea. She produced her driver's license and confirmed both her name and the appointment time without the flinching or change in register that Preston Hale had apparently expected to produce. And he took the license and held it for a moment, longer than the situation required, before returning it without apology, already moving toward the next construction. He announced that the Aurelius LX line had recently implemented a pre-qualification standard for test drives. Something about protecting vehicles from what he called casual inquiries, and that the current threshold for a demonstration was a verified deposit of $50,000 held until the appointment concluded. He delivered this with the practiced fluency of someone reciting an actual policy, and in the presence of customers who had no way to know whether it was real. The performance was nearly convincing. What Preston did not know was that 22 minutes earlier, Gavin Pike had handed the keys to a black touring sedan to a customer in a linen blazer and Italian shoes without requesting any documentation beyond a standard license check. The customer had driven for 40 minutes, returned the car with a scratch on the rear quarter panel now recorded as pre-existing, and no deposit had been collected, no credit verification conducted, no threshold applied, because no threshold of that specific kind existed in any document Kingsley Crown Automotive had ever produced. The requirement Preston was describing had been invented in the space between his certainty about who Imani was and his certainty that she would not challenge it. Imani asked him directly whether the $50,000 requirement applied to all customers equally or specifically to customers in her situation. And Preston did not answer the question but rearranged it into something about fiduciary responsibility and institutional reputation. And when Imani waded through the rearrangement without responding, he changed direction again and suggested there were excellent pre-owned options at a facility a few blocks east. Gavin Pike, who had drifted within earshot, produced a smile in the muscles around his eyes, not directed at Imani but at the consultant beside him, which gave it the insulation of commentary rather than mockery, but accomplished the same thing. A few customers nearby had begun to watch, and Preston recognized the audience and raised his volume slightly, pressing his invented requirements with the confidence of a man who has never been wrong about who belongs in a room and who does not. He held up a hand toward Tessa when she started to speak, and she stopped, and her mouth closed around whatever she had been about to say. Imani reached into her bag and produced her phone, and she did not point it at Preston or open any application that could record what was happening. She composed a single message and sent it to an attorney named Elaine Whitmore, who had been anticipating exactly this kind of development since Imani had told her that morning that she intended to arrive at the dealership as a private individual. She put the phone away. She looked at Preston and said clearly that she did not need him to change his requirements. She only needed him to confirm, on the record, that this was how Kingsley Crown chose to treat her. Preston said that was absolutely correct. He said it with the composure of a man who has not yet understood what he has just confirmed. 3 months before that Friday afternoon, Imani Rhodes had stood at the head of a long conference table on the 14th floor of a building in Atlanta's Midtown district and told her executive team that Rhodes Meridian Mobility was ready to expand. The company she had founded 11 years earlier from a storage unit rental, and 3 high-mileage sedans had grown into one of the most respected premium fleet service providers in the Southeast, offering corporate transportation contracts and vehicle procurement to businesses that needed reliability at scale. And the expansion plan called for fleet operations in 3 additional cities over 18 months, with the first phase beginning in Atlanta, a full refresh of the existing fleet to match the premium positioning the company had built over a decade. The number in the first budget projection was 120 vehicles, and the number on the cost sheet beside the Crown Aurelius LX designation was close enough to $18 million that the rounding felt almost polite. Imani had spent years earning her instincts and trusted them the way some people trust instruments. not because they were always right, but because they registered things no spreadsheet was capable of capturing. And one of those instincts told her that a supplier who treated everyone well when the contract was clear would treat everyone well when the contract hit complications, and that the inverse was equally reliable as a predictor. Before she authorized procurement at that scale, she wanted to see what the dealership looked like when nobody knew she was walking through the door. Her legal counsel, Elaine Whitmore, had suggested sending a junior associate with a standard inquiry to test the experience, and Imani had declined. She had driven 130,000 miles in her old sedan and was perfectly capable of driving it to a dealership in the same city where she had built her company. Kingsley Crown Atlanta was the leading candidate for the full fleet contract. Preston Hale had submitted a competitive proposal and reached out 3 times through the corporate channel to express his enthusiasm for the partnership, writing in the final message that Kingsley Crown prided itself on treating every customer with the same standard of care, regardless of the size of their purchase. Back in the showroom, Elaine's reply arrived with 2 messages in sequence. The first confirmed that the company's line of credit had been validated that morning. $20 million in available credit from a Tier 1 institution, with same-day transfer authorization on any amount up to $10 million. The second said that she had documented the dealership's conduct in sufficient detail to file a formal complaint, and that her professional recommendation was to redirect the full fleet contract to an alternate vendor and let the matter proceed through the appropriate channels. Imani replied with 4 words, "Give me 1 hour." She put the phone away and turned a slow quarter circle, taking in the room with measured attention of someone whose professional life had been built on understanding the precise relationship between what a space contained and what it was actually worth. 15 vehicles on the showroom floor, 9 more in the delivery preparation zone, visible through a corridor left partially open, and every one of them already matched. She knew from the specification sheet she had reviewed that morning to the configuration her company required for the launch phase. She turned to Tessa Monroe, who was standing quietly beside the reception counter with the look of someone calculating which problem in front of her was solvable, and asked a single question: whether every vehicle currently inside the building was available for purchase that day. Tessa Monroe checked the inventory system, confirmed the count, cross-referenced the delivery schedule, and told Imani that all 24 vehicles, 15 in the showroom and 9 in the delivery prep zone, were currently available for immediate sale. Gavin Pike heard the confirmation from across the room and made a sound that landed between a laugh and an exhale, directing it at the consultant beside him rather than at Imani directly, which gave it the comfortable distance of a private joke while still being audible to everyone within 15 feet. He said something about the cost of damaged pride and gestured loosely in her direction, and his colleague responded with a smile that confirmed he understood exactly who the observation was aimed at. Preston Hale crossed the floor slowly and stopped at a distance that was close enough to oversee the exchange without technically being part of it. The performance of a man willing to observe an unreasonable situation precisely as long as it took to confirm it was unreasonable. And he said that if the lady intended to purchase 24 luxury vehicles that afternoon, he would be happy to arrange a tour of the showroom, and that Tessa's time might be better spent with customers whose intentions were, as he put it, clearly established. Imani did not respond to him. She asked Tessa to print the full inventory list, unit identification numbers, listed price for each vehicle, applicable taxes, and all fees the dealership intended to include in the final transaction cost. Tessa printed the list and handed it across the counter, and Imani reviewed the pages without visible reaction, until she reached a column near the right margin labeled Supplemental Service Bundle, a line item that added, on average, $1,400 to each vehicle's listed price and appeared to include maintenance programs and accessories that had been pre-selected without customer input. She asked whether the bundle was mandatory or could be removed at the customer's request. Preston stepped in before Tessa could answer and explained that the package was a standard feature of the purchase experience at this location, and represented meaningful added value for the customer. Imani asked, without changing her tone, whether added value required the customer's consent before being added. Preston said that she was welcome to seek whatever experience she preferred at a facility better equipped to handle her budget, and at that moment, the phone on the desk inside the finance office began to ring. The finance manager, Martin Keene, stepped out to answer it, and the expression that came onto his face as he listened was not one anyone in that showroom had seen before. It was the particular stillness of a person absorbing information that has just rearranged the room around him. The caller was from the corporate banking division. Rhodes Meridian Mobility had submitted a payment guarantee letter in the amount of $5 million, verified, authorized, and ready for immediate application to a vehicle purchase transaction at this location. Martin Keene was 44 years old and had spent 9 of those years managing the financial operations of Kingsley Crown Atlanta. And in that time, he had processed transactions for professional athletes, real estate developers, and one former government official who paid cash for 2 vehicles simultaneously and asked that the paperwork be complete before his driver finished lunch. And what he was looking at now, a $5 million payment guarantee in the dealership's corporate account, attached to the name Rhodes Meridian Mobility, was something he understood required an immediate change in every assumption the last 40 minutes had been built on. He stepped out of the finance office, still holding the phone, and asked the room, with the controlled urgency of someone managing a potential error, who was the authorized representative of Rhodes Meridian Mobility. Preston Hale heard the company name and moved forward with the forward momentum of a man accustomed to placing himself at the center of things. He had heard of Rhodes Meridian Mobility, as had every automotive supplier in Georgia who tracked the fleet procurement market with any seriousness, and he announced that he would personally coordinate with the arriving representative, scanning the room for someone who matched whatever image he carried of what a corporate emissary from a company of that size was supposed to look like. Imani Rhodes said, from where she was standing, that she was the authorized representative. Preston turned and looked at her the way a person looks at something that has produced a sound it is not supposed to be capable of producing. He said he meant the executive representative. She said again that she was. He asked whether she had documentation of that authorization, and she said she did. And before she could produce it, the front entrance opened, and a woman walked in carrying a legal document case and moving with the unhurried precision of someone who has been in more difficult rooms than this one and found them all manageable. Elaine Whitmore placed 4 documents on the reception counter in sequence. A notarized letter of authorization identifying Imani Rhodes as founder and chief executive officer of Rhodes Meridian Mobility. A current certificate of good standing for the corporation in the state of Georgia. A direct written confirmation from the issuing bank of the payment guarantee's validity, and a brief summary of the afternoon's interaction that she had assembled from the notes she had taken while listening to Imani's real-time account over the phone. She referred to Imani by her full title without emphasis, the way a person states a fact in a room where they expect it to be received, and the silence that followed had a texture to it, dense and specific, different from the quiet of a room that is simply not busy. Gavin Pike had already opened a search on his phone and was looking at a photograph of Imani Rhodes on the cover of a regional business publication from 14 months earlier, standing in front of a fleet of vehicles with the same expression she had been wearing since she walked through the door, and he closed the phone and put it in his pocket. Preston underwent a reconstruction that was almost interesting to observe. The administrative patience drained out and was replaced by the rapid assembly of warmth, directed at Imani as he described the earlier interaction as a procedural misunderstanding the team would want to resolve immediately. Imani waited for him to finish, and then she said that she intended to purchase all 24 vehicles currently in the building, because her company needed them for a fleet launch in 11 days, and this location had the inventory, and the transaction would proceed with Tessa Monroe as the sole credited consultant on every unit. Preston said Tessa lacked the experience for a transaction of that scale. Imani said that experience held less value than she had once assumed, particularly when the alternative was the version of experience she had been observing since 3 o'clock. Tessa entered the first vehicle identification number into the sales system. The screen populated the preliminary figure. Preston, who had already mentally positioned himself at the center of the commission structure, processed what it meant to be removed from it, and then said quietly, in one last attempt at authority, that he had the right to supervise any transaction of this magnitude. Imani said that right was not in question. She said only that it would not be exercised today. Preston Hale had not reached the general manager position at a flagship dealership by accepting outcomes he had not designed. And what he understood in that moment was that a sufficiently credible procedural concern could pause a transaction long enough to allow him to reposition himself at its center. So he went to Martin Keene with what he described as a compliance concern. A payment guarantee of this size, delivered to an unverified corporate contact on a same-day basis, presented characteristics that warranted review by the group's financial security team before any documentation was signed. He used the word laundering once, and then, observing Martin's expression, did not use it again. Elaine Whitmore, who had remained near the reception counter and had been setting down precise handwritten notes throughout the afternoon, said without raising her voice that she would treat any unsupported allegation of financial impropriety as the basis for a defamation action, and recommended that the dealership's own legal counsel be contacted before anyone pursued that avenue further. Preston said he was simply following protocol. Elaine asked to see the protocol's written documentation. He said some protocols were understood rather than written. She wrote something in her notepad and underlined it. Meanwhile, a junior staff member who had spent most of the previous hour managing the internal security camera feeds as part of his unrelated responsibilities quietly printed a 45-minute segment of the main showroom footage and slid the pages across the counter to Elaine without explanation, and she received them the way a person receives documents they were already expecting, with immediate and focused attention. What the footage showed across the recorded period was 6 separate test drive initiations involving other customers, 3 of which concerned the Aurelius LX specifically, none of which had included any request for a deposit, a credit check, or documentation beyond a standard license review. Gavin Pike appeared as the facilitating consultant in 4 of those 6 initiations. Elaine noted the times and vehicle identification codes beside the existing entries in her summary. Imani had said nothing additional to Preston since Tessa began entering the sales records, and she redirected her full attention to the specifications on her phone, confirming which trim configurations were available in the delivery-ready units behind the partition, while Tessa cross-referenced each unit against the fleet standards Imani described. Preston told Tessa at that point to step away from the terminal and allow a senior consultant to manage the transaction, and Tessa looked at Imani. Imani said only that the arrangement they had agreed upon would remain as stated, and that if any member of the staff was instructed, pressured, or threatened in connection with this transaction, the documentation she and her counsel were compiling would be submitted to the Georgia Motor Vehicle Commission and to the federal oversight body, with jurisdiction over dealership consumer practices. Preston said he was not threatening anyone. Imani said she had not suggested he was. She had only noted what would follow if anyone happened to be. The bank completed its verification call at that moment. Final confirmation that the payment guarantee was valid, fully funded, and authorized for immediate application to a vehicle purchase transaction. The Kingsley Crown corporate monitoring system, which tracked transaction sizes across all 27 branches, generated an automatic alert. The pending sale at the Atlanta location had reached a preliminary valuation that no single transaction in the branch's recorded history had come close to reaching. The alert routed to the office of the group's founder. 40 minutes later, 3 black vehicles stopped in front of the dealership's main entrance. Rhett Kingsley was 61 years old and had built his automotive group across 3 decades from a single franchise in Charlotte into a collection of 27 dealerships across the southeastern United States. and he came through the main entrance at a pace that was neither hurried nor ceremonial, acknowledged the staff who positioned themselves to receive him with a nod that was polite and conclusory, and then looked for the person he had actually come to see. He found Imani Rhodes near the reception counter beside Tessa Monroe at a terminal, and he crossed to her immediately, bypassing Preston Hale entirely, and said her name with the ease of someone for whom the name had carried weight for some time, reaching out to shake her hand in front of 17 staff members and 4 remaining customers. And the gesture had the quality of a sentence completing itself in a room that had been waiting a long time for the verb. He had spoken with her 3 times by video conference over the previous 4 months, and had told his operations director, after the second meeting, that Rhodes Meridian Mobility was precisely the kind of company Kingsley Crown needed as a fleet partner in the market it was trying to reach. He said he had planned to fly down the following Thursday to finalize the fleet contract, and was pleased she had come to them first. Imani said she had come earlier than planned because she wanted to observe the client experience directly, as a private individual, before making a commitment of that scale. And she said this without heat and without dramatization, as a sequence of accurate facts, in the order they had occurred. She described the afternoon in 4 stages: arrival and absence of service, the invented deposit requirement and its selective application, the refusal to allow the test drive, and the subsequent characterization of her financial transaction as a compliance concern requiring security review. Rhett listened without interrupting. He looked once at Preston, who had positioned himself near a vehicle display with an expression constructed entirely from the components of calm. Preston said that, without knowing the identity of the customer, certain precautionary procedures had been applied, and that any misapplication had been a matter of judgment exercised in good faith. Rhett asked where the $50,000 test drive deposit requirement was documented in the dealership's current policy materials. Preston did not answer immediately. Rhett asked again. Preston said the language required updating in the formal documentation, that in practice it had been understood among senior staff. Elaine placed the printed security footage log on the counter. Rhett examined the times, the vehicle codes, and the consultant names for 30 seconds without speaking. Then he looked at Imani, and she said that she intended to complete the purchase of all 24 vehicles in the building, because her company needed them, and this location had the inventory, but that the fleet contract for the remaining 120 vehicles would not be routed to the Atlanta branch. She had already identified an alternate supplier in the region with a service record more consistent with the standards her company applied to its own client interactions. She said this without apology and without visible satisfaction, stated the way a business decision based on documented performance is stated, simply and as fact. Rhett Kingsley turned to Preston Hale and asked the question in a voice that had shed its warmth but not its deliberateness. He said, Preston had refused to allow her to drive 1 car, 1 appointment, 1 afternoon, 1 key, and in exchange, the branch had just lost the contract for 120. What followed was not a celebration. It was paperwork, and Elaine Whitmore worked through it with a methodical efficiency that treated every number the same way she treated everything else, as a something that needed to be precisely correct before anyone signed their name to it. She had already flagged and formally objected to each line item in the supplemental service bundle, and Martin Keene agreed to their removal without resistance, after Elaine noted that mandatory inclusion of pre-selected add-on services without customer consent created specific exposure under Georgia consumer protection statutes. The adjusted pricing applied the corporate fleet rate that Kingsley Crown's own original proposal had listed 3 months earlier, a rate Preston Hale had apparently forgotten he agreed to in principle when an $18 million relationship had still seemed like an outcome he was positioned to secure. Tessa Monroe opened each sales record, entered the adjustments, and confirmed the vehicle identification numbers against the physical inventory log, while Imani reviewed and initialed the documents in sequence, using a pen she had carried in her bag, a detail Tessa noticed and thought about later when she tried to reconstruct the afternoon in its correct order. The preliminary transaction total appeared on Martin Keene's screen before it appeared anywhere else, and he did not say the number out loud, but 3 staff members, who had gathered at a professional distance, read it from where they stood and went very quiet. $3,860,000, confirmed and funded, the wire transfer instruction submitted to the bank's commercial processing line. Imani signed the final authorization sheet, capped the pen, and returned it to her bag. And she had not looked at Preston Hale since the moment Rhett Kingsley had arrived. The staff in the delivery preparation zone had begun moving. Prep checklists initiated, key sets organized in rows on a rolling cart. The vehicles that had been lit and arranged and polished for the purpose of suggesting aspirational arrival were being transferred, one by one, into the practical possession of a woman who had been told that morning she had no business handling a key. The showroom that had been designed to hold them, to frame them, to use their presence as a signal about the kind of place this was, grew quieter with each car that left, and the staff who remained on the floor moved through it with the slightly altered posture of people adjusting to a space that has just changed its meaning. Gavin Pike appeared near the left side of the counter while the first group of ownership documents was being assembled, and said something to Imani about a strong decision and exceptional vehicles, and the hope that the fleet would serve her company well, and he extended a hand. Imani looked at the hand and did not take it. She said that the warmth people found at the end of a transaction was worth considerably less than the warmth they chose before they knew how the transaction would conclude, and she said it without particular emphasis, the way a person restates a principle that has always been obvious to them. Preston came to stand at a careful distance while Imani completed the last section of documents and asked, in a voice calibrated to suggest he was asking on behalf of the dealership rather than himself, whether the purchase was primarily driven by the business need she had described, or whether it was also intended to cause him embarrassment. Imani finished writing a date in the signature field before she answered. She said the company needed 24 vehicles for a fleet launch in less than 2 weeks. Those vehicles were in this building, and that was why she was buying them here, and that the consequences Preston was experiencing were the result of choices he had made, not choices she had made. And the distinction mattered because she had come into this building intending only to drive one car, the Crown Aurelius LX that had been withheld from her at the start of the afternoon was the 14th unit on the inventory list. She told Tessa, when the paperwork for that vehicle was complete, to bring it out of the delivery zone. She said she did not want anyone from Preston Hale's team driving it. Tessa took the key. Rhett Kingsley suspended Preston Hale from his duties at the Atlanta branch before the last vehicle had cleared the delivery bay, using the word suspended in its administrative sense. The investigation would conclude before anything else did. The suspension was not announced to the staff through any formal channel. Rhett simply informed Preston, in a conversation in Martin Keene's office with the door closed, that his access to the dealership's management systems had been temporarily revoked, and that the group's compliance team would be in contact within 48 hours. Preston came out of that office looking like a man who had just been told that the structure he had been standing on was not, in fact, load-bearing, and he moved through the showroom toward the exit, without stopping, without speaking, with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have only just begun to understand the full dimensions of what they have lost. The quarterly bonus he had been tracking for 11 weeks, a 6-figure sum he monitored with the discipline of a person who treats personal financial metrics as a form of self-expression, was placed in administrative hold, contingent on the outcome of the compliance review. Gavin Pike was informed separately that his sales authorization had been suspended pending review of his conduct during the afternoon's interaction and the footage that substantiated it. He said something about having been misread, and the person informing him did not respond to the characterization. Rhett Kingsley approached Imani with an apology that was formal in structure and genuine in delivery, and she listened to it fully before she responded. When he finished, she said that an apology directed at her personally was not the redress she was interested in, that on an ordinary Friday afternoon, without legal representation, without a corporate account, and without the specific sequence of events that had caused the finance office phone to ring at a decisive moment, the experience she had documented would have ended differently, and probably had ended differently for other customers she would never know about. She produced from her document folder a single page she had written during the 45 minutes the paperwork was being processed. A list of 3 structural requirements she was asking Kingsley Crown to implement across all 27 locations. A published and uniformly enforced test drive policy with no discretionary deposit thresholds. A mandatory bias awareness training program for all customer-facing staff conducted by an external organization with no financial relationship to the dealership group, and an independent complaint intake process that did not route through branch management. Rhett agreed to each item in writing before he left the building. He extended an offer to discuss the fleet contract under whatever terms Imani considered appropriate. She said the contract had been transferred, that she understood a company was not its worst employee, and that other Kingsley Crown branches might operate very differently from what she had observed that afternoon, but that she had evaluated this location as a proxy for the group's service standards, and it had provided its own evaluation. Tessa Monroe asked whether she would accept expanded responsibilities while the branch restructured, requested time to develop the skills the role would require before formally accepting a new title, and Rhett noted that response in the materials he handed to the compliance team, describing it as a demonstration of exactly the relevant skill. When Preston, just before he left the building, found Imani near the exit, and said that many of the dealership's employees had no part in what had happened, and would suffer if the consequences extended too far, Imani said that the 24 vehicles she had purchased represented the largest single-day revenue transaction the branch had ever recorded, and that she had made sure of it for the sake of exactly those employees. The only person in the building who had not gained from the afternoon's outcome was the person who had designed it that way. The Crown Aurelius LX came through the delivery bay doors at 10 minutes past 5, driven by Tessa Monroe with the precision of someone handling something she intended to return undamaged, and she parked it in the main lot with the engine running and stepped out and stood beside the open driver's door with the key. The lot was quieter than it had been at 3 o'clock, and the vehicles that had occupied the showroom floor and the delivery preparation zone were now recorded in documents rather than inventory, and their absence had left the building with the particular echo of a space that has been recently and completely changed. Tessa handed the key to Imani and said that she had been genuinely worried, for approximately the first 20 minutes of the afternoon, that she was going to be let go for printing the inventory list. Imani said that courage was not the absence of that kind of worry. It was the decision to print the list anyway, knowing the worry was real, and that what it was pointing at might actually happen. And she said that distinction was not a small one, and that she had encountered it in every consequential decision she had made in the past 20 years. Tessa received that in silence and held it. 2 weeks later, the 24 vehicles from Kingsley Crown Atlanta entered service as the inaugural fleet of Rhodes Meridian Mobility's Premium Transport Division, with 8 of the units, designated for a driver training and certification program Imani had developed in partnerships with 2 vocational schools in the metropolitan area. A direct pathway from technical education into professional fleet employment that the program's first class of 14 participants completed on a Thursday morning in late October, each of them receiving a placement offer before the final session ended. The remaining 16 entered daily service in Atlanta under a dispatch team assembled specifically for the expansion phase, and the operation ran on time from its first day, which was not an accident but the result of 11 years of knowing precisely what the failure of a single variable costs. Tessa Monroe's commission cleared in installments that the dealership's accounting department processed without a word, and the total exceeded her annual salary by a margin she declined to discuss at work, but which caused her, on the evening the first installment arrived, to sit in her car in a parking lot for 11 minutes before she could go inside. She was promoted 3 months later, after the branch completed its compliance audit and implemented every policy revision on the list Imani had left behind. Rhett Kingsley's compliance team concluded its review and found 9 prior internal complaints that shared structural characteristics with the experience Imani had documented, none of which had been escalated beyond branch management. Preston Hale's contract was terminated. Gavin Pike resigned before the review reached a conclusion. The independent complaint channel Imani had requested was operational within 60 days, staffed entirely outside the branch management structure, and in its first quarter it received and processed more inquiries than the dealership's prior system had handled in 2 years. Imani did not monitor the implementation once it had been confirmed in writing. She had stated her terms, made her decisions, and returned to the 14 other things that required her attention. On the evening the fleet entered service, she drove the Aurelius through Atlanta's amber late afternoon light, with the contract folder for a new partnership resting on the passenger seat. A smaller dealership 2 counties north that had built its name quietly, over a decade, by treating every person who walked through the door with the same consideration, regardless of what was parked outside, or what they happened to be wearing that day. Preston Hull had believed he possessed the authority to decide who was worthy of holding a key. But the woman he had turned away from one car had quietly taken every key in the building, and left him standing in a showroom that his own certainty had emptied.